Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, out there in podcast land listening to us, or on our YouTube channel, or Rumble, wherever it is you find us. Today, I am joined by my co-host, Roddy Lau, and Taz Akhtar, and today we are going to be diving into the report. And that is the report, of course, that was made by the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. But before we get to that, guys, how was your week? How was your weekend?
Not too bad.
What'd you do this last week? Anything exciting, Roddy?
Mainly some research and video games.
Yeah.
And then read through the report.
And video games. What are we playing these days?
I'm playing Call of Duty Cold War. I don't know why some people don't like it, but I found it's much better than the alternative camper zone known as Warzone.
Warzone? Nice. Yeah. I'm a fan of the...
I call it the camper zone.
I like the first-person shooters, but unfortunately I've been a little bit busy. What about you, Taz? What'd you do this weekend?
Not too much. I headed to the park actually now that we're allowed out of our houses from groups of 6. We threw around some American rugby, what do you call it? American football.
Football. Oh yeah, how we have it, football.
Yeah.
Yeah, as opposed to soccer. Yeah. So the pigskin is what you can.
You call it football.
I think you can call it the pigskin. I'm pretty sure that's not a term that has been hijacked as being any kind of offensive or otherwise. But yeah, we in America call that pigskin so as to avoid confusion when we're overseas across the pond, as you say, between football and soccer. Okay, so that's nice. Yeah, it's nice to be out in the park. We had some exceptionally good weather. I was personally surprised to see how many people were out and about. It was really nice to see that many people out and about. Again, I'm really happy for it. What about you? You joined me for a little while there.
Yes, with the birds.
Yeah,
squirrels.
We took a walk, didn't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, fed some squirrels, did a little bird feeding, some parakeets in Hyde Park. If you're not familiar, beautiful green birds. Took some time to feed them, and then worked on this report, which is a big piece of information, and I'm very happy to go through it with my friends here, with my co-hosts, and dip into it. There's been a lot of talk about this report already. I think you've noticed there's been some feedback online. I've noticed for sure there's been some feedback online, a lot of pushback, a lot of negative pushback, which quite honestly I'm pretty surprised by.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, a lot of the pushback that's been happening surrounds itself with the fact that people believe this report has a bias to it, or that it's perhaps the government's attempt to wash its hands of racial problems. I'm going to weigh in after having actually read the report and say it's my belief that is not the case whatsoever. And as a matter of fact, when you take a look at the commissioners, the first thing you'll notice is that everyone is a person of color except for one man. I think one man. Well, we'll take a look at it. I'm pretty sure there's just one man that is not a person of color, but everyone else is. And the chair himself is a man of great renown and quite a few accomplishments to his name. But that's not just him either. The entire commissioning board is full of people with high awards from the empire, British awards, the CBEs, MBEs, PhDs. So this is not just some thrown together rush job. This is a very in-depth, 200 and some pages. What was it again? I think 250 pages? 250 pages on a wide variety of topics, and we're going to bring that to you. We're going to cover that exactly, the breakdown of some of these topics. But let's start off. Who's the chair? First of all, let's talk about him.
Tony Sewell.
Okay, yeah, and let's talk a little bit about his accomplishments. What do you think of this guy, Taz?
Yeah, I've heard he's got a CBE and he's got a lot of qualifications, PhDs. It sounds like he knows what he's doing.
Yeah, he's an exceptional figure. He starting with his PhD from University of Nottingham is where he was educated. He has 2 other PhDs from the university, one from the University of Exeter. Is that how you say that? Exeter?
Exeter.
Yeah.
Exeter, great. And University of Essex, as well as fellowship at UCL. How about that? So, and that CBE, for anyone listening in America across the pond, you're not sure what that is. That is the highest ranking Order of the British Empire award. That's an award. Obviously, there are two higher accomplishments that can be bestowed on a person. One is the Companion of, what is it?
Knights.
Right, Knights and Knights and Dames, I think it is, and then another is like a Companion of Honor.
Grand Cross, if I'm not wrong.
Right. So in any case, as far as the British Empire awards go, the CBE is the highest, and this is Dr. Tony Sewell has this, as well as, like I said, the UCL fellowship and the PhDs. He's been in education and a teacher at Sussex University. So this is not some, this is not just some person coming on to make the government look good and to help wash their hands of any racial issues. This is, in my professional opinion, having been a criminal investigator and investigated this guy, looked into his accomplishments, it is a very serious gentleman, and he's flanked by other serious people, one of which being Dr. Maggie Adarin Pocock. She's also holding the MBE, African American female, black female, and this one blows my mind. I mean, so when I hear things online about people like, this is not a good report, these people are talking heads or whatever, this is a female who dominates in physics and engineering, okay? She's a perfect example, in my opinion, of what a spirit of drive and determination can accomplish, which has led to her work to the MBE. And that's before we even get to the third person.
Can I just say with Tony Sewell as well, he also set up a charity, Generating Genius, so he's not some kind of guy who doesn't care about the disenfranchised.
Right. No, another thing you're going to notice with all these people is all of these people seem to have some sort of charity that they've either set up or that they work with, donating their time to the disadvantaged. And so, I don't know how you feel, Roddy, I feel those are the exact people that we want telling us, what's what when it comes to disparities.
Yes, also I think their educational background, definitely they can unpack the information and the data and what people say and put them together to give some kind of a fair opinion from what they know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think just in Maggie Adarin alone and Dr. Tony Sewell, right there we have enough to combat Labour MP David Lammy's saying, that this report was a, quote, this is his words, divisive polemic which cherry picks statistics, which is interesting because then he goes on to cherry pick two statistics of his own to make his point and then leaves out context, which is to me a very hypocritical statement of racial inequality when you leave out any contextual support, and that kind of undermines the power of the statistics. And what you're going to see in this report is it does not do that. It doesn't leave out context, okay? It gives you all of the context. It doesn't cherry pick data or reports. It gives you a broad range of information. And I think the whole point of this report is for you to see the good, bad, and the ugly. I think it does that.
Yes, I think later we will see when we get into the report, maybe probably cross-verify this word I like to use.
Right.
The data they use.
And they give you all the links, so you can literally do that.
I think it's really well-referenced report.
Right, and this is another thing that I would like to highlight right here, and I hope I remember it. I'll make a note here. Remember. So later on in the report, there's going to be other reports that I draw from, where people draw from other sources which are hostile or which have been flagged sources of information, or in one case we'll talk about an Instagram story where there's some postings that Everyday Racism _ has posted, which are racially divisive and simply untrue because they don't hyperlink anything, they don't cite their sources, they don't give you any further information. And they specifically leave out very important contextual information, which makes it easy to allude to something nefarious. And this report certainly doesn't do that. The third person I want to talk about before we get any further is Aftab, and God forgive me if I pronounce this incorrectly. I believe it's Aftab Chugtai, and he is an MBE. And this person is a very well-established business person. He has an impressive record of contributions to the community, working on the Grenfell Task Force. If you're not familiar with what the Grenfell Tower was, that was just, it was a tragic moment in Britain's history. And, you know, I don't want to dive into that rabbit hole. That's something I think we should eventually talk about because there's a lot of history behind that. But, you know, he was working with that task force. He chairs a police independent advisory group, and we'll be talking about police relations in this, as well as disparities within policing. And then a Muslim burial council. So, you know, he owns a business named Aftab's. He's got an exceptional record, and the only dirt I could find on this guy was one incident where one of his employees was not making the right amount. But I think when you check into that, you'll see that this person initially said that they were going to be a part-time and go to school, and so the pay was for part-time, but they ended up choosing not to, or deciding not to, or not being able to go to school, and never said anything, and so they remained at the current pay scale. Once it was brought to his attention, he did the right thing, you know, and he fixed it. And so I feel like that's a big part of what this report does, is it's like, it's not propaganda, okay? It's not inflaming race relations. It's identifying truths, and even if they seem to be stereotypical or whatever, and leaving all that aside and saying, here is what we can do to fix that.
At least I can say they're trying their best to make it as impartial as possible.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's no real spin to it. It's more just the data, the facts. Not necessarily, I mean, cherry picking means that you pick out only a few bits of data.
Right, and we're going to have
that's
great...
what people do when they accuse them.
And we're going to have great examples of that.
List of facts.
Right.
You know, that's with context. It's fun.
Right, so we're going to have great examples of that. Now, on this board, there are also other people: Keith Frazier, Nareen Khalid, Dr. Dambisa Moyo, Mercy Maroki, Martin Oliver, Dr. Samir Shah, Kunle Olulode. I'm pretty sure I pronounced that wrong, and I apologize. Blondell Clough. So there's a lot more individuals on this commission, and you really should read up on this commission, what their history is, their background. They are all, you know, top of their game, intelligent people. Very little of any of them had any history of being in the news for this problem or that conspiracy or this upstart. You know, I mean, these are just good people that are very educated, very well qualified. So when I hear people dismissing this report out of hand on its face as being an attempt to, you know, to cover up or absolve the government of race problems, this is simply not true. Okay, I think important to get to right away whenever you're going to dip into a new subject of study, a new knowledge, is what would you think? Definitions. Right.
Before you go anywhere,
sure.
you need to say what your defining parameters are.
Right.
How they're getting changed.
Right. Yeah, you can't just enter a conversation and be like, well, I think X means Y, and when I say that, I perceive you to also understand X means Y, but you understand X means Z or Z, as you say here, then you have a mismatch, right? So
you need to set the boundaries of what these words mean.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Words have meanings, and then you can see.
The main thing is to bring
right.
The main thing is to bring us to the same page.
Right. So starting off, I think we just say this: racism is literally defined as, and I'm using a definition off of Google, which I believe it was Oxford, but don't quote me.
From Oxford Languages.
Yes, it is Oxford Languages, and its definition is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership of a particular racial or ethnic group. And then it goes on to say typically one that is a minority or marginalized. I think we just stick with prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism, right? And it's by one entity to another entity because of their membership of a particular race or ethnic group. All right, that is literally racism.
Yeah.
With that in mind, moving forward, the commission felt it was important to further define some terms because people seem to be getting confused between racial disparity and racism, okay? And those are two separate things, all right? So in life, you're going to find many occasions where outcomes are not equal, okay? And that is disparity. Now, is it racial disparity? Well, yes, if it affects one group or race more than the other, but that does not mean that it is racism, okay? Is it a possibility that racism is involved? Yes, absolutely, it is a possibility.
Is it a possibility that it's going to have more than one factor? And
Absolutely. Is it
possible?
one thing?
Right. Is it a possibility that racism is the very smallest factor and that there are 30 other factors, all of which, have significantly more impact? Absolutely. Right? That is absolutely a possibility. So I think the takeaway from that is like jumping straight to racism is the cause and you have no proof or evidence to support that. It's like, wow, that's problematic.
Yeah, in my mind, it's a kind of extreme reductionism.
Right.
When we have a problem, we jump into the most straightforward or the most obvious solution immediately.
Right, but is it obvious, or is it because you say that's obvious? I feel like obvious is something that is, maybe it sticks out, but it is also true. But it doesn't necessarily make it correct. It might be the one that most people jump to.
It's one, at least can be one of the many things in the picture.
Right, absolutely. Okay, yeah, and again, many things in the picture. All on board on that. So let's talk about the explained racial disparities, which is the first one. So we just said there's two terms that we need to focus on: racial disparity and racism. So explained racial disparities, okay? This term should be used when there are persistent ethnic differential outcomes, okay? So what does that mean? Let's just break it down from there. When there are outcomes that are different and ethnicity is involved and they're persistent, that's what we're talking about when we're referencing explained racial disparities, okay?
It's the things we know why.
Right, exactly. Exactly. I mean, thank you for that shorthand. Absolutely right. So they're things we know why, and they can be demonstrably shown to be as a result of other factors such as geography, class, or sex. So not racism, okay? So explained racial disparities they're not racism based, okay? They're a result of other factors such as geography, class, or sex. And this happens. And that doesn't necessarily make them classism or sexism, because again, you got to go to those sections and find
yeah.
and right and so I think we'll get to this eventually, but I want to say there are primary characteristics and secondary characteristics, or primary indicators and secondary characteristics, and we'll discuss that soon. But there are things that actually cause the problem, and then there are things that are just part of the problem that are characteristics of it, not necessarily causing it.
So causal and coincidental, right?
Right. So, right, exactly. And we'll get into that. I don't want to dive into that right now because that's coming up later in the podcast. But it's important to understand that when we're looking at explained racial disparities, we're already seeing them talk about factors such as geography, class, or sex. And some of those can be primary factors, and some of them are secondary. The next one we're going to talk about is unexplained racial disparities. And so this is a lot like the first one, except in this case, we don't know. Right, we don't know. Like, there's no evidence to support that it is racism of any kind, whether institutional or systematic. But there's no proof to say that it's not. We don't know. Okay.
There is some disparity that we can't knuckle down, but it might not necessarily be down to pure racism.
Right, exactly. It may too. Again, we just talked about this. It may be one of the factors, but there might be 20 other factors that would have more of an impact if you fix those, as opposed to focusing on racism. Okay, so that's unexplained racial disparities.
We always have things where we are unsure about, and I think one of them in America was had different housing structures and stuff like this.
Right.
Which was something probably people didn't know at the time, and kind of as we learn more,
right.
There's always going to be unexplained things. If something's unexplained, you can't.
I mean, that's science. That's science. When you're studying science, there's plenty of things that are unexplained, and this is an aspect of social science. So it's understandable that things, you're not going to have the answers for everything. You should not rush into it and say, oh, well, we can't explain it, but I just feel like it's racism. That's...
Yes, I guess there are like different things which are very hard to quantify,
right.
Like culture is
right.
something
like,
very hard to
and thankfully this report does...
Lifestyle.
This report, I think, does an exceptional job at digging into these and giving some foundational work to what some of these terms should be and how they should be looked at, how they should be framed. Being a history and philosophy of science student at UCL, I'm super impressed by this report and how it's written. Super impressed.
Also from a point of view of philosophy students who doesn't play with number that often.
Right.
I know some research because I'm very interested in psychology and sociology, so I can understand some of these reports, but well, this one is doing a quite good job. At least I can distinguish between good and bad research.
Right, and you get that feel right away when you start going through this, like, this is good research. They did a good job. And I'm going to point out, we will point out points where it's like there is racism, and we will show that. And we will point out parts where it makes the case that, certain elements are not racism, and that it's people's, liberal use because of other factors, that it's just easier for them to say this is racism and without proof, make that claim. And that's where, this report even addresses those situations and how it worsens it for the actual victims of racism. And I will tell a story about my time in CID and relate that to, some of my CID investigation accounts, where, to make that more clear, is like, you do a disservice to people who are actually experiencing injustice when you make fallacious claims, about,
like libel or something.
Right?
Like
Yeah. I mean,
if you broaden if you broaden the term racism to include, just like what we see about misogyny, if you broaden those categories too much, you get everything.
Right.
You lose everything. Right. If everything is racist, then nothing's racist.
Right. And so let's talk about that point real quick, because I think I have that here in my summary, and I want that to be part of the discussion. The next three definitions are institutional racism, systematic racism, and structural racism. I don't really want to cover all of those in detail here. I want to say that I think that they're pretty well written. You listening out there, you should really get the report and read them for yourselves. The one or two comments that I do want to make is that, they are self-explanatory. Unfortunately, they are subjective, and just like Taz had mentioned, it's unfortunate. They're subjective. The words, like, they use, like, attitudes, quote, or behaviors, without further qualification. It leaves a lot of room still for people to make accusations without proof and potentially cause problems. I feel like.
I guess the easiest way to explain these three words is it's just from a level. Institution is like a specific university or company,
right?
And systemic is society level,
right? And persistent, right?
Yes, and structure level is going through history,
right? And so what they used in these terms that I didn't really like are specific things like behaviors and attitudes, which is, those are very open-ended terms, and they also left out, I would have liked to see personally, the words demonstrated, which means to give a practical explanation or exhibition of, and possibly patterned, meaning decorated with a repeated design, because if something is structural or systemic, it should be patterned, right? You should be able to demonstrate it. It shouldn't be this ethereal, vaporous subtlety stuff. Like, there should be distinct qualities of something that you can point to, and it should be patterned. That's my opinion. Okay, you don't have to like it, but that's not referring to racism in general. That's referring to structural, as well as institutional and systemic. I think those are my opinions. Take it or leave it. It should be patterned, and it should be demonstrated.
Yes, I guess there's like a line where we can cut it.
Right.
There are obvious things we can see.
Right.
Like, if an organization is particularly mean towards a specific group, it can be quite obvious to find if it's really profound.
Right, and it should be patterned, right? Like, if they're mean to one group, it's not going to just happen one time.
Yeah,
it's going to happen over and over and over.
And happens to everyone from that group.
But when I say mean, I think, like, mean is another subjective term, right? Like, we need to be careful about the lingo we use, because being mean to a person doesn't necessarily make you a racist, right? Okay?
Yes.
if you're mean to that person because they are the race that they are, that's the difference.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's an important thing to keep in mind as we go through this report, because they dispel with a lot of the, the claims in this report where they say, oh, it's mostly this. And they even say, well, actually that is not true.
Yes. Another point I want to point out from the institutional, systemic, and structural racism.
Sure.
What precisely it means is an organization, a society which don't have racist, but it produces disparity between groups.
I was going to say another thing about. I'm cautious to use these terms because I think if you've got institutional, structural, and systemic, that means that we have got, from an economics point of view, we've got underused resources. For example, we've got groups of races that are not being used to their potential.
Right.
Therefore, if we were to look at the country, the UK, we would have to see that it's underperforming, and I don't think it benefits anybody to be not utilizing a certain group of people. So
right, or utilizing them in an unfair way. Yeah. And this report has the following sections that we can address for that. It breaks down, and we're just going to talk about these real quick before we get to the introduction. We're going to take a quick break and then come back. But the groups that we'll be talking about are education and training, employment, fairness at work and enterprise, crime and policing, and health. All right, welcome back, gang. Glad to have you with us. We're going to get back to the next parts of this discussion. We're moving into the introduction, as well as why BAME, the term BAME doesn't work, and then the language of race. And we will be finishing up with the Instagram post that we want to bring to your attention. That is a post by Everyday Racism _ on Instagram. And we're just going to be evaluating that post in regard or reference to this report after we kind of talk a little bit about the introduction, as well as some other terminology that is important to kind of frame this discussion going forward. These are the sections that I said you should read, but however, we are going to give you a few important highlights in case you choose not to read it for whatever reason, but you should, okay? So without further ado, the introduction. Anything that kind of jumped out at you after reading this, Roddy or Taz, that you were surprised by, or just give me your first thoughts.
I mean, the fact that it openly says that we do not believe that UK is yet a post-racial society, but it's completed a long journey. Right.
So that's quoted directly from them.
Yeah. So they're not like a kind of, they're trying to be fair, level-headed.
What do you think post-racial means in that sense? Anybody care to, post-racial?
Really interesting, because nowadays I think what you see is people actually not wanting to be post-racial. Post-racial, right. I'm assuming, is saying that the race of a person is irrelevant and you judge them.
Right. Some people, I think, in the social sciences might argue that, like, irrelevant aspect. Here, the best way I can describe this is I think back to my military time, right? There is a saying that we has, like, you don't see anybody's color, the only color you see is green. And that's because you enter basic training together, people of all races, all beliefs. Y'all get your head shaved together, y'all get spit on and hit with paddles, and you have your rucksacks dumped out, and you have your wall lockers thrown out the windows and your stuff and drawers thrown out the window. I mean, everybody gets punished. In basic training, none of us got it, no one got it any easier or harder than the next guy. Everybody was a quote turd, and everybody was blasted because they were a quote turd. So going through that together, you share traumatic experiences, you build bonds. When it comes to time you get to your units, I did not see color, I just didn't. Like, everybody to my left and my right, whether they were black, white, red hair, dark hair, Asian, whatever it was, like, I knew that I could count on them. And the dirt bags were just that. They were the dirt bags. They weren't specific colors of any kinds or race or any. They were just the people who didn't pull their weight. So I feel like I got to live in what I felt was a post-racial situation. Like, they're just... Yeah. Everybody was either good or bad, and those were the two.
Race doesn't matter at all.
Right. It did not, Now you did see that there were some. I did see, looking back, that there were some groups that were predominantly more one race than the other. You know, whether it was like support services. I don't know why. I never looked into it. But the first thing I think is not that racism was involved. The first thing I think is probably that maybe one group is smarter than the other and doesn't want to get shot in the head with bullets. You know, so they took a better job that was nicer. You know, for the same pay. You know. Some people might say, "Oh, is racist? Is that?" It's like I was on the front lines.
Maybe they're just cowards.
Yeah, no, I mean, maybe they were, maybe they weren't, maybe they really enjoyed what they did in that technical regard, and like, I guess what I'm saying is this is a lot what this report talks about. Is like I'm not jumping right to racism. There could be a lot of explanations for why they didn't choose to be a bullet sponge like the infantry. So.
I think if you find any differences, you can't. I mean, the other thing is not only will you always find differences between groups, they may also have slight differences in general.
It's similar to difference between individuals.
Right. So this one thing I think that's mentioned in this report that I really like, it says right there in black and white, is outright racism still exists in the UK. Whether it surfaces as graffiti on someone's business, violence in the street, or prejudice in the labor market. So, they admit coming right out of the gate in the introduction a couple of things that are important. That's one of them. Another one is that the country has come a long way in 50 years, and the success of much of the ethnic minority population in education and, to a lesser extent, the economy should be regarded as a model for other white majority countries, because that is what we have in the UK. According to 2011 census, I think it was like 86. Let me double check that. I think it was like 86% or something, 81 or 86%. We can fact check that later, but that was 2011. 2021 census is coming up, so we'll have that data. I'd be surprised if it was more than, changed more than it's probably still somewhere around 70 to 75%.
Yeah, I think it's probably higher than that. I think it's 80, 90 something.
Okay, so we'll see. We don't know that, but I think this is important. It says this is a model for other white majority countries, and I do feel like, having lived in London, and coming from Montana, where people stop and gawk at, people of color, and this is not a slam on, or it's not so much anymore, but in small towns in Montana, you're not, some people may have never seen a black person except on TV. This got on my heart, this is just a thing, and so
we also don't have the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So I feel like living in London, I get the benefit of a very post-racial society, at least in my opinion. Maybe they don't see it that way, and I'm not going to debate them on that. They're very intelligent people, and they've said that they don't believe it's a post-racial society, but I can say it feels a lot like my time in the military, where all of my friends are all varieties of every kind, color, creed, and I like that.
Do you have aliens?
Not alien. I don't have aliens yet. So again, if you're on the podcast and you happen to be an alien, even if you're a reptilian, as long as you're a nice reptilian, reach out.
But I'm not so fond of the idea where it's pushing out their idea that how other countries should be run. I think I don't.
Yeah.
I think at least it's a kind of, it's probably a common theme or common goal we want to achieve. We don't want to live in a full-blown racist society, which literally from the definition that report, we want systemic racism.
Right, where
we don't want.
Let me ask you this. We're kind of deviating from the topic, but I'm going to have a squirrel moment with my ADHD. I have diagnosed ADHD, and so now I'm distracted. How's China factor like that?
Actually, that's what I want to talk about.
Yeah, sure. Dive into it.
Maybe you are an alien. You can read my mind. Anyway, that's something I want to say. It's really China and the Chinese Communist Party is actually just recently getting Chinese citizenship easier.
Right.
Yeah. Before, even a few years ago, before I left there's almost no way to get Chinese citizenship without being ethnically Chinese.
Really? So if I were to marry a full-blown 100% Chinese woman in China, live there, I would not, back in the day, would not have been able to become a Chinese citizen?
Probably. Even today, even even today, it's still quite difficult.
You know what else is like that? Kuwait's like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
also,
you don't become a Kuwait citizen if you marry a Kuwaiti female.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm gonna have to. I think it's you can see it as kind of imperialistic to say how other countries should be run.
Right.
I mean, I think in terms of, I don't think in terms of short term. I think if you're talking about societal and evolutionary in terms of hundreds of years or maybe thousands of years.
Right.
To tell
Well,
us-
evolutionary is technically millions of years,
millions,
but I get your
right,
point.
So I think I would be cautious to tell other people how they should do what they're doing.
Right.
And I think if you're noticing, you're running out an experiment, and we're not too long in, right? 50 years in.
Right.
Technically something that you don't know where it's going.
Right. Well, it's
very
changed
strange to
drastically.
say how other people should behave as if everything's all good
Right.
in your
Well,
own country.
right. But they're leaving places like that and coming to places like that for the reason is that there is less racism, there is less systemic,
There's more
institutional.
opportunity.
Right. Like that's what we're.
Yeah, people are not coming here in little boats to
Right.
enjoy.
Right. They're not risking their
racism.
lives on the seas, to.
Yes, there's a reason people vote
Right.
with their feet.
Right.
But they can't vote with their ballots.
And I think that's why this report was generated. Good kudos to. This is a one time, and I'm not, against Boris Johnson. So if you're listening, which you're probably not, I'm not against you. I just think you've made a lot of bad decisions in your policies. But this is one I have to give you kudos for. You selected the right team. They put together a comprehensive report. It's very fair and balanced. And without much more ado, let's just talk about a little bit more about this intro before we jump over.
Just give me 1 minute.
Sure, yeah. Did you want to finish up about China, or did you want to go off?
I want to read a little bit this part. It's
Right.
from Yuri Bezmenov's book. Like he wrote a little bit about probably a relevant thing why people are going to the Western countries.
Right.
The book is called Love Letter to America.
Okay.
It's written by a KGB defector from the Soviet Union.
Right.
And I think it's written in the 70s, 80s. Here's not a paragraph, a selection of a few sentences. I will tell you, many people have been more than willing to be exploited the American way. For what other reason have thousands risked their lives, gone to unimaginable troubles, left behind their family, their motherland, and traditional ways of life to come to America? Have you ever heard of illegal aliens risking their lives crossing the border at midnight into socialist USSR? Or the boat people swimming oceans and drowning by the thousands just to reach the shores of communist China? Or defectors like me, leaving behind relative affluence and risking bullets in the back in order to join the progressive workers' paradise in Russia? No. We all come here to America, obviously willing to be exploited by capitalists and enjoy oppression together with you because we believe and know America is a better place.
Right. And so I'd like to just caveat on to the end of that and say, I think a lot of that applies as well to the UK, in this introduction, they make a statement that says, we found that most of the disparities we examined, which some attribute to racial discrimination, often do not have their origins in racism. And that's kind of a big deal, right? When we're moving through this, we see that that's a big deal, that oftentimes a lot of what you're seeing in the media and what people are thinking or saying is racism, it just isn't. In this report, it's trying to help people understand what the truth is so that you can get to the objectives and the outcomes that you want. It's not trying to wash its hands or absolve itself. It's trying to make the situation better for everyone.
Yes.
And I'd just like to say a point on what Roddy was saying, that you mentioned that people vote kind of in their feet. So I think nothing is black and white, and if you do anything in life or you make any decision, there are going to be pros and cons, and to highlight the cons and not
Right.
the pros is the essence of being unfair.
Right, and that's actually...
if you're going to go to a country and assume that it's going to be perfect, then obviously it's going to have negative.
Right, and
but
that's...
if you're going to highlight those and just kind of like say, well, it's all bad, it's
Right.
overgeneralization.
That's a term actually that I'd like to bring up because it's called being Whiggish, and that was in the first part where they talked about the country, in 50 years and the success that it's come to this is a key point right up front. Many postmodern social movements seem to have this uncanny ability, right, to be Whiggish and unrealistic in their protest, right? Especially when it comes to the present moment, completely discounting the history. By that I mean, they forget that progress happens over time, and they make the comparisons to some utopia in their mind, and that doesn't exist. It's not in real life. Okay, in the context of the UK, they may now reside here, having fled an oppressive regime, right? Possibly one that's hostile to certain members of its populace, and systemic, racism, institutional racism, or even oppression, or even committing atrocious human rights violations. Okay, so it's not fair to come here and in the UK start denigrating the country of the UK because it's not the way that you want it in the utopia in your head. Yeah. And it's especially egregious to come in and do all of that without any evidence whatsoever. And talk about, it's subtle, so it's hard to prove. Like that, wow, just the audacity and the harm that you're doing when you make those claims,
Stay tuned. Maybe you'll have an interview with me about what I have experienced in communist China.
We're going to definitely, after this report, we're going to definitely dig into Roddy Lau's his past and his history and coming into this country, and give you the perspective of someone who quite literally fled one of these countries that we're talking about with human rights violations. And and just to know this man and see how happy he is about his station in life, how do you feel when you see people like that are just making these claims that,
Well, to be honest, I have experienced some sort of institutional racism when I was back in school, but I won't say they have malicious intentions. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, but they do want to achieve something that may not be in line with what you want to achieve in life, correct?
Because,
in that essence, they're taking away your free will, correct?
Yeah, basically. Long story short, it's basically when I was entered that school. Already went to British international school before I came here. But from their experience, students with Chinese origin can't speak English properly.
Right.
So they want me to do English language instead of English literature, and want me to do Chinese literature. So it's basically doing the way opposite I want.
Right.
And then the consequences kind of, I manage it, but the outcome is definitely probably less than perfect if we did it another way around.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to get into his interview, and folks, we're going to put a pin in that, folks, because you're going to really like this interview. You're going to be impressed. And this is one of the people that we'll have on our show that you're going to be impressed by. He's also happens to be a co-host here, so stay tuned for that. Yeah. Okay, and so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about one of the more important parts in this report, which Roddy has highlighted, because I think it's, this is very important information, and this is in the introduction, and it's something that we need to pay attention to. Okay, it's something that's important for everybody to understand. It says, however, and this is the report, so I'm quoting, however, there is also an increasingly strident form of anti-racism thinking that seeks to explain all minority disadvantage through the prism of white discrimination. Now, we're going to have an example of that coming up later, but I think it's important to note that this is a very significant line in this document, okay? When you think anti-racism, the first thing to your mind should be your awareness should come to the center, and you should focus and look for clues. Because some of this anti-racism is going to be extremism, okay? It's going to be extremism under the guise of anti-racism. And you need to be smart enough to spot those situations so that if you come into contact with them, that you avoid a very highly charged situation that might get you or someone else in trouble or in danger, okay? And you see that with groups, perhaps protesting, rioting, violence, things like that. So it's something to be aware of, that anti-racism is a term, and that this report is talking about some of this thinking seeks to explain all minority disadvantage through the prism of white discrimination.
think
And this diverts the attention from the other reasons for minority success and failures, including those embedded in the cultures and attitudes of those minority communities themselves, okay? So what this is in this instance is saying is don't make the mistake of coming in to blame all the disadvantages on through the prism of white discrimination, because there are other issues. And when you do that, you are literally taking away the ability to focus on the other issues and fix them, because like we've talked about, if there's 20 things that are happening and racism is the smallest aspect,
Or
why
maybe even a little bit bigger.
or even if it's the fifth largest aspect, but there's 15 others that are more impactful, why are we focusing on this specific issue as opposed to all the others? You do yourself a disservice. And we're going to show you an example in an Instagram story later of exactly what that looks like, what that kind of anti-racism looks like that seeks to divide instead of address the truths of the situation.
Yeah, so if we can summarize it, I think what we need to say is, if you have a problem, you need to dissociate what's causing that problem and assign proportionality to it.
Right.
So nobody's saying things don't happen, but to what proportion does it cause what's
Right.
happening, or to how big of a deal?
Right, and are you if you really want the problem solved, are you better focusing on the things that have more of an impact, versus this one cause? Like if you are truly, if you are truly victimized, and there's several things that you're victimized by, why are you only picking one to focus on? If there's 5, 10, 15 things.
Like people fall over their shoelace and they get bad knees, right?
Right.
That's a problem. But how big of a problem is that? I mean, should we spend millions of taxpayers' money to try and solve?
I think this report makes an exact, I think this report makes that concise argument on what should be focused on and what needs fixing. And this report doesn't come in a vacuum. It comes with recommendations, which again, if you read, you will see we're only going to do the highlights.
Yes. One thought I have when it's actually a while ago when the first time I came across with the anti-racism, that term. My first thought is, what do you really mean anti-racism?
Right.
Are you going to dismantle the Ku Klux Klan, or trying to find out the racists in society, or there are some other things you want to do?
Right.
I think probably it's the latter. I never see Antifa.
Look, I think if you're dismantling the KKK, good. Like if that's what you mean by anti-racism. Again, I'm not saying all anti-racism is bad, but I am saying there's going to be some cases of extremism posing as anti-racist.
Yes.
And we got to be aware.
If your worldview is so simplistic making a T is not as simplistic as a model. If all your problems can be put down in your worldview through as a result of racism or white supremacy, then you've built a really poor model.
I feel like, if you think the only thing in the world keeping you down is any sort of racism or sexism or bigotry or whatever,
thing, right?
if that's the only thing keeping you down,
It's
I
a
think,
poor model.
huh?
It's a poor model.
Yeah, I mean,
Model.
it's clearly not true. Like there may be cases where it is true, but it can't be everything in the world.
And
it can't be,
in itself,
and it can't be the only thing. Like there's other factors, right?
It's also racist in itself to try and say that means that people of certain groups will do better just in a monoculture of their own people.
Right.
I mean, that's the essence of racism.
Right.
So, I mean, kind of anti-racist, you could argue, is kind of racist. If you think that that's the only problem, then surely those people would be better off with people of just their own color.
Right. Well, I think in this report you'll see that simply isn't true. Like when it comes to crime and policing, when I talk to you about crime and policing, you're going to see that the majority of cases that are violent crimes, it's like 80% figure or more. I'll get the exact figures. If it's a black victim, it's like 80%. I think it's a black perpetrator.
Yes.
So you can't just say that. Oh well, if you remove race from the issue, that it's going to be, the problems are going to away. No, absolutely not.
There's more
similar to Asians.
Intra-violence than there is inter-violence.
Right.
And I think it's pretty much similar with the sexes as well. There's
right. We're going to get to all of that in this report, so I don't want to jump ahead too far, but yes.
Yeah, my last thought about the anti-racism thing.
Sure.
And then I realized it's saying anti-racism. What it means is systemic racism. It's, I called Coleman Hughes when I was listening to him earlier. He said systemic racism in a short sentence is racism without the racist, as I mentioned it before.
Racism without the what?
Without the racist.
Uh-huh.
So what anti-racism means is trying to change the system.
Yeah.
So that's become a kind of probably get into the realm of the conspiracy.
Right.
Like why the system there. Like it's similar to the flat earth theory. Like we believe the flat earth, I believe earth is flat, but you believe earth is round. So, and then you present all of the evidence why earth is a sphere, it's not flat. Then the flat earth will say these are misleading.
Right.
And then we'll get into the whole conspiracy, the world government organized all sorts
Right.
of
See, I think
things.
the farther that you have to dig down that rabbit hole to prove your point, the more off track you become. You know,
Yeah,
like
it's similar.
look,
to
if you can't do like this report did, and just give the facts and all of the links and citations, and instead you choose to do like everyday racism _ has done, and just put here's the whole picture, and you just put this small bit of picture, then I think automatically it's like your side loses, right? Like
it's something beyond that. It's getting to the, at least that Instagram post we are going to talk about later actually gives some data.
right.
But like
But it doesn't give citations to that data. And it doesn't give
I think
the
they
full
did.
picture of the context.
Yeah, they did put that in
Where?
the end. Yeah, probably didn't see it.
Yeah,
but that's
perhaps.
Yes. The main thing I want to talk about is the people who propose systemic racism. They're not trying to get the data because the data is part of the conspiracy theory.
Yeah, so
That's
I'm
the
looking
main-
at this and I don't see...
I think it's the last page.
Oh, the very last
I
page?
see what you're saying.
Yeah, that's the main thing. That's
So
the
you're saying
okay.
If you were to say
Okay, so, but all right, that's great. And we will get to that when we get there. The only problem I see with a lot of this is, you know, they're citing Harper's Bazaar, The Guardian, you know, The Mirror. I mean, these are
quite obvious life.
well,
Bias.
hold on. These are not scientific articles. You know, these are people doing reports. And how do we feel about generally the news and its reporting is it's already biased.
Especially the Guardian.
Right. I mean, that's why we have the term fake news nowadays, right? That's why that term exists, is because, you know, those organizations are filled with people, and those people have very not strict writing regulations, and, you know, they put bias all throughout that. So citing a news organization like that, you know, it's like I question those figures, especially when you have this report citing figures that dispute the figures that everyday racism talks about. But we haven't got there yet.
Yeah.
I'd like to just wrap up real quick on the introduction because of our time, and I'd like to take one point that I point to specifically, you know, is that the disservice being done when everybody, or not everybody, I don't want to say that, the disservice being done when it comes to disparities, and people attributing that to racial discrimination when it's not. You know, and in this paragraph where we just talked about, however, there's an increasingly strident form of anti-racism thinking that seeks to explain all minority disadvantage through the prism of white discrimination.
Yeah,
I think that when you're going through this and you're looking at it, referring back to our definitions, what we talked to about unequal outcomes, it's important to understand the following. Okay, not all outcomes are equal. All right, there is going to be disparity in outcomes, but that doesn't necessarily make it wrong. It doesn't necessarily make it bad. It used to be, you know, you could get a trophy if you came in first as a team in baseball. In my youth, anyways. I don't know about anyone else's youth. I'm a little bit older here. I remember when they started giving out top 3 trophies, right? It wasn't just the first team, it was the top 3 trophies. So now first, second, third. Eventually, when I was grown, I discovered that kids were getting participation trophies, okay? Just for participating. And then eventually it came that everyone got a trophy and there was no distinguishing between first, second, and third place.
So this is actual credit. I mean, it's like, you
so
know,
it wasn't
everybody's beautiful, no one's beautiful.
right. It's that's I think that's the point. And the point I want to cap and make here is this is a prime example of where society went wrong with interventionism and equality of outcomes. Okay, a lot of what people are saying, oh, this is racism, is because they're focused on equality of outcomes, right?
Yeah.
And that's not, you need to be focused on equality of opportunity, okay? Equality of outcomes is where some may include racism and most will not, as this report shows, okay?
Yes.
But equality of opportunity, that's where you can really put a lot of focus and effort, because that's where most of the injustice is done.
Yes. But from the anti-racist position, again, their thinking is there's a conspiracy there, like the racist overlord is making the system unfair.
Right. I mean, I think that's a very generalized view, but yes, I think there are a few people out there. And when you say anti-racist, I want to caveat to say not all anti-racist people think that.
Yeah.
I want to say I think the extremists, that's how they look at it, right?
It's basically the postmodern position.
Right. That's a very extremist anti-racist perspective. It's not maybe generally all of the anti-racist perspectives, but the extremists, I think, do have that kind of conspiracy feel, right?
Yes.
Where it's like, you can't prove it because they won't allow you to prove it.
Yes, it's similar. That's why I say it's similar to the flat Earth theory. It's a
Makes
kind
sense.
of a double down.
Makes sense. I don't want to get flagged on YouTube for bringing up flat Earth and
Well,
I don't want to get flagged on YouTube for bringing up flat Earth and racial disparity, because then we'll have comments like, oh, these people are terrible. They don't believe in racism, and that's not what we're saying at all. Okay, you have a group, all right, of anti-racists that are part of a larger group, and of these anti-racists you have a very small, very extremist part of the anti-racists, and we're relating how they view things and make their case to flat earth conspiracy theories, like, oh well, if you can't prove it because the man doesn't want you to prove it, and all these barriers are in the way, so you could never prove it if you wanted to. Same with flat earth, right? It's like, they'll never let you get out of orbit to see the earth, even though Elon Musk is saying he's going to be flying people to Mars. So at some point, the jig is up, flat earthers, is all I want to say. Okay, at some point the jig is up.
Yes, it's a common theme about conspiracy theory, really. If we really think about that.
Right, is that it's hard to prove, right, or impossible to prove.
There's always somewhere to double down.
Right. Okay, and I think that's what the point of this report is we want to stop the they've gone down all the rabbit holes for you, and they've analyzed every single piece and every single part.
I think I've got it. You're saying if it's an unfalsifiable theory, it's not a good thing.
Right. If it's unfalsifiable, right.
If you're going to give you evidence, you're going, that's only part of a bigger picture,
right.
And it's always going to be racist at the
right.
end of it.
If it's not testable, if it's not falsifiable, then it's not good science, and that's what we know, having been trained already in science. In philosophy, is if you can't falsify it, if you can't test it, I mean, you can't. Then it's vaporous nonsense, in the words of one of the articles, that I.
But one thing
that
to
I
bear
read
in mind: the postmodernists don't believe in science.
That's another rabbit hole that we're not going to go down right now, Roddy. All right, let's wrap up on our introduction, folks, and we'll take a short break. I want to say, I think one of the things that becomes clear when you're reading this report, there are a multitude of factors which affect outcomes, and most of these factors need to be met head on with personal responsibility and accountability of the individual, as opposed to pressuring the government to legislate either advantages or shortcuts or remedies in cases where it's just where it's just not racism, where it's simply disparate outcomes, and those outcomes have reasons for being, where they are literally, as we said in our definitions, explained racial disparities. Okay?
Yeah.
To the benefit of nobody, actually.
Well, does it even benefit the race that it's supposed to benefit if it's an explained racial disparity and it has a good reason for being that way? Does that really help them? Does making a shortcut or an advantage does it really help them in the end? I think not. I think it's a lot like that trophy situation, right? Like, if there's certain things that you can correct yourself and you don't, and you rather someone else legislate those corrections or advantages for you, then it's like the participation trophy thing. Then everybody believes that it's someone else's problem to fix, their situation.
One thing to remember: we can't legislate everything. Legislation is not a silver bullet to
So,
everything.
but this is where we get back to, and this is the last point I wanted to make on this before we close this topic. You can't legislate morals, all right? And we've already gone the secular way of ditching religion, which I'm not going to get into that. I do feel like religion has some good moral value, Some religions definitely do, and I think that it's important to have moral rule. And when you get rid of moral rule, this is what you see. These reports are necessary because there's no morality, right? And so you have to look for government to clearly define your morality and what's right and what's wrong. Otherwise, people just say, "Oh, this is wrong" all the time with no proof to that effect, and other people jump on that bandwagon and start to believe it, and then everybody's running around saying, "Oh, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is this, that, and the other thing, racist, classist, sexist," without proof. And everybody's getting worked up into a fuss rather than actually solving the situation, right? And this report gives you the framework to solve the situation.
To a victim of which you cannot escape.
Right. That's one of the many things that it does. Yeah.
One thing to remember, if legislation works, then why don't we legislate to get rid of COVID?
Yeah.
Pass an act of parliament.
You are just working on getting us flagged, aren't you? Like, you really want YouTube to just... thankfully, this is a news and satire show. So, YouTube, news and satire. That was a joke. Hopefully you laughed. I'm smiling. So, I think... That joke, let's consider it landed.
If it works, then why don't the parliament say, we want to get rid of COVID from now?
Yeah, and here's the bill. Right.
Yes, and here is the signature of our gracious lady, the Queen.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we will be back after this. Thank you very much.